My parents told me I was the strong one. They said it so often it stopped feeling like a compliment. I was 17 the first time I understood what it actually meant. It meant they had already decided I didn't need them. 15 years later, I was standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, watching my younger brother's rehearsal dinner unfold in a room I had quietly helped save. My mother saw me from across the floor and went completely still. My brother's fiancée turned from the head table, looked directly at me, and said, loud enough for the table nearest her to hear, "Everyone needs to stop. This man is the reason this weekend is even happening." The music from the string quartet faded awkwardly. Someone set down a fork, and for the first time in my adult life, my father looked at me like he was genuinely trying to figure out who I was. Let me back up. My name is Miles, and I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, the older of two sons. My brother's name is Declan. He's 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, the space between us in my parents' eyes felt more like 30. It wasn't that they were cruel people. I want to be fair about that. They worked hard. My father spent 26 years as a branch manager at a regional credit union. My mother taught elementary school until her early 50s. They weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. There was always enough. The question was always where it went. When Declan was 14, he mentioned offhand that he wanted to learn guitar. By his next birthday, there was a Fender acoustic propped against the living room wall with a bow on it, and my father had already found a music teacher 2 streets over who came on Thursday evenings. When I was 14, I told my parents I wanted to do a summer hockey camp in Peterborough. My mother said, "We'll see," and the summer came and went without another word about it. I didn't bring it up again. I told myself it didn't matter. That was the first time I told myself that. It would not be the last. I didn't grow up angry. That's something people get wrong about situations like mine. The resentment didn't come in like a wave. It came in the way water gets into a basement, slowly, through cracks you don't notice until the damage is already done. There was no single moment that broke me. It was 1,000 small moments, stacked quietly on top of each other over 18 years. Like the way my parents talked about Declan's grades at dinner. Not because they were exceptional, they weren't, but because anything he did became a topic worth 30 minutes of conversation. My own marks, which were consistently better, got a nod and maybe a, "That's good, Miles," like the way family gatherings seemed to orbit around Declan's updates. What Declan was planning, what Declan was thinking about, what Declan needed next. I sat at those tables and ate my food and understood, gradually, that I was expected to be the backdrop. The hardest part wasn't the inequality. The hardest part was that nobody acknowledged it. Not once. Not my grandparents. Not my aunt who visited every summer. Not the family friends who came for barbecues on the long weekend. Everyone just accepted the arrangement like it was natural. Like some kids are the focus and some kids are the furniture. The year I finished high school, I'd already accepted that I was going to fund my own post-secondary education. My parents had made noise about Rees when we were young, but I later learned that Declan's had been topped up regularly, while mine had been left mostly untouched since I was 9. There was no conversation about it. No explanation. I found out when I was 17, by accident, when I overheard my mother on the phone with my grandmother, talking about how much they'd been able to save for Declan's university fund. I remember standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, my socks on the cold tile floor, not moving. I applied to engineering at Queen's University and got in. I sat at the kitchen table one evening in March with my acceptance letter and a rough estimate of what 4 years would cost. Tuition, residence, books, the basics. I laid it out in front of my parents after dinner, not asking them to cover everything, not being dramatic, just showing them the numbers and asking, plainly, whether there was anything they could contribute. My father looked at the papers for a moment. Then he said, "Miles, you're capable, you'll figure it out." He said it like it was encouragement. My mother agreed. Then she mentioned that Declan had an orthodontist appointment on Thursday and asked if anyone wanted more tea. That was the conversation. That was all of it. I took the maximum student loans available through OSAP. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I worked 20 hours a week at a warehouse on the edge of the city, sorting freight on the overnight shift 3 nights a week. I budgeted down to the dollar. There were months in second year where I ate a lot of pasta and skipped social things I couldn't afford. And I did not call home to say so, because I knew no one would answer that call the way I needed them to. Meanwhile, updates about Declan came through in the indirect, background noise way that family information always travels. My mother would mention that they were helping him with first and last on an apartment in Hamilton, that they'd co-signed a car loan for him, that they were covering his cell phone plan while he finished his diploma. Small things individually, a pattern in aggregate. Here is what I want to say clearly. because I've spent years getting here. I did not spend those years stewing. That's not what happened. I had a choice at some point, probably in my second year of university, sitting in an engineering library at 2 in the morning, with a thermos of coffee and a circuit analysis assignment, about what to do with the anger I'd been quietly accumulating. I could carry it forward and let it make every decision heavier, or I could set it down and use the energy for something else. I set it down, not completely, not all at once, but incrementally, the way you pay off debt. I stopped waiting for my parents to notice what they were doing. I stopped updating them on my life because I realized their reactions, or lack of them, had been measuring my sense of worth for too long. I went quiet, not out of spite, out of self-preservation. I graduated with a degree in civil engineering and a transcript I was genuinely proud of. I articled at a mid-sized firm in Ottawa, got my Peng designation at 27, and eventually moved into project management and then consulting. By my early 30s, I had built a specialty in heritage infrastructure. Older buildings, bridges, structures that needed careful, technically complex rehabilitation work. It was niche enough that the client pool was smaller but loyal, and the referral network was strong. My parents knew broadly that I was an engineer in Ottawa. That was roughly the extent of their understanding of my professional life. I hadn't offered more, and they hadn't asked. I want to be precise about something. I didn't hide my success deliberately as some kind of setup. I wasn't waiting for a reveal. I had just stopped narrating my life to people who had never really been listening. The invitation to Declan's wedding arrived by email in late February. He and his fiancée, a woman named Audrey, whom I had met exactly twice, were getting married in early June. The venue was the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. The rehearsal dinner was the Friday evening before the ceremony. I almost didn't go, not out of bitterness. I want to be honest about that, but because I had genuinely built a life that didn't include many of these people, and re-entering that orbit felt effortful in a way that was hard to justify. But Declan had called me himself to ask. It was the most direct he'd been with me in years, and something in his voice made me say yes. What I didn't tell him, what I had no real reason to mention at the time, was that 3 months earlier, my consulting firm had been brought in as the structural remediation lead on the Fairmont Chateau Laurier's East Wing rehabilitation. The project had been delayed twice due to contractor issues and heritage review complications. We'd resolved the last major dispute in January. By February, the property was back to hosting events, including weddings that had been provisionally booked and nearly cancelled. Audrey's family had booked the venue 18 months earlier, long before the remediation project began. When the delays threatened the timeline, the hotel's management had flagged a list of events at risk. Audrey's wedding was on that list. As the project lead on our side, I had been part of the technical discussions that allowed the East Wing to be cleared for occupancy and events by April. The wedding was able to proceed as planned. Neither Declan nor Audrey knew any of this. There was no reason they would. The engineering work happened behind the scenes. My name was on the reports, not on any correspondence they would have received. I arrived at the rehearsal dinner on a Friday evening in June. I wore a dark grey suit and felt, honestly, like a stranger at a party I'd been technically invited to. I recognized some relatives I hadn't seen in years. A few did a visible double take when they placed who I was. I'd filled out since my 20s. Different posture, different haircut, the particular quality that comes from spending your 30s doing work you're good at and being paid fairly for it. I stayed near the edges of the room and talked to the people who came to talk to me, which were fewer than you might expect. My parents were there, of course. My mother hugged me and said I looked well. My father shook my hand and told me the drive from Kingston had been good. We made the kind of conversation that happens when two people have never learned how to speak to each other honestly. I noticed Audrey at the head table, going through what looked like a venue coordinator's checklist on her phone. At one point, she showed something to the coordinator standing beside her, and the coordinator pointed in my direction. Audrey looked up, then she looked at her phone again, then back at me. I watched her expression shift. It took her a moment, then she stood up. What I didn't know until that evening was that Audrey's mother had saved every piece of correspondence related to the venue booking, including the formal letter from the hotel confirming that the East Wing remediation had been completed and that the venue was cleared for events. The letter was signed, as project correspondence typically is, with the lead consultant's name and designation, mine. Audrey had seen my name in February and not connected it to Declan's brother because she'd met me exactly twice and didn't know my last name clearly enough to register it. When the coordinator pointed me out and confirmed who I was, she put it together. She walked across the room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performing anything. She was just visibly affected. She said, "You're Miles. You're the engineer. You're Declan's brother." She said it like the sentences were taking a moment to connect. Then she said, louder than I think she intended, "Everyone, I need everyone to hear this." The room went quiet. She explained it clearly and quickly. The venue had nearly cancelled their booking. The delay in the engineering clearance had put the entire event at risk in January. The project lead who'd resolved the issues, whose sign-off had allowed the event to proceed, was standing here right now at her rehearsal dinner. And he was her fiancé's brother, who had apparently told nobody. I want to tell you, I handled that moment with total composure. I mostly did. But there was something happening in my chest that I wasn't entirely prepared for. What I remember most is my father's face. He was standing about 12 feet away, beside the bar, holding a glass of red wine. He went through several expressions in about 4 seconds. Confusion first, then recognition, then something I'd never actually seen on his face before, not directed at me. Something that looked, from where I was standing, like the particular discomfort of a person who is reordering something they thought they understood. My mother reached for my father's arm. Declan crossed the room and stood in front of me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You knew the whole time?" Not accusatory, just trying to understand. I said, "I knew I was the consultant on the building. I didn't know it was going to matter at this particular moment." He nodded slowly. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He hugged me. Not a polite back-pat hug, a real one. Like someone apologizing for something they didn't have the words for yet. The dinner continued. The string quartet started up again. People began talking in small clusters the way people do when something has shifted the atmosphere, and they're not sure how to metabolize it. A few relatives made their way over to me and said things like, "I didn't realize you were doing so well," with a particular emphasis that told me they had previously assumed otherwise. My parents came over together. About 20 minutes later, my mother spoke first. She said she hadn't realized. She said that a lot of times, in different ways, over the next several minutes. She hadn't realized the scope of what I'd been doing. She hadn't realized how much I'd built without them knowing. She said she was proud, and the word caught in her throat in a way that made it sound genuine, which almost made it harder to hear than if she'd said it easily. My father was quieter. He's always been a man who processes slowly and speaks less than he means to. He said, "I think we owe you an apology that's bigger than tonight." He said it plainly, without preamble. It was the most honest sentence I'd ever heard him say to me. I didn't feel victorious. That's the honest answer to the question I've been asked a few times since. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt tired and grateful and sad, in roughly equal parts, which is a strange combination of things to feel standing in a ballroom at your brother's rehearsal dinner, while a quartet plays something by Vivaldi in the corner. I said, "I appreciate that," and I meant it. What I also said later, when my parents asked if we could talk more seriously in the coming weeks. I said yes, but I told them something I needed them to understand first. I told them that I'd been managing my own feelings about our family for a long time, and that I'd gotten to a place where I was okay. Not performing okay, actually okay. I told them that reconciling, if we were going to do that, had to be something we built slowly and honestly. It's not something that happened because a moment had made it feel necessary. I told them forgiveness wasn't the same as trust, and that the second one was going to take considerably longer than the first. My mother cried. My father nodded like he was writing something down internally. Declan and I spoke alone for about an hour that night, long after the dinner had wound down, and the venue staff were clearing the last of the tables. We sat in 2 chairs near the windows with the Rideau Canal visible below us, dark water catching the light from the chateau's exterior. He told me things I hadn't known, that he'd noticed the difference between how they treated us, even as a kid, that he'd benefited from it and hadn't said anything, and felt guilty about that for a long time without fully acknowledging why, that he'd assumed I was fine, partly because I'd always seemed fine, and partly because it was easier to assume that. I told him I understood. Because I did. We hadn't been competing with each other. We'd been placed into a dynamic neither of us designed, and we'd each handled it the only way we knew how. The distance between us wasn't really about us. We exchanged numbers before we left that night. Real contact details, not the polite version that gets saved and never used. He texted me the next morning for the ceremony to ask if I'd help straighten his tie. I was already in the lobby. I went up. The wedding was beautiful, as it turned out. The east wing of the Fairmont looked exactly as it should. Restored stonework, rehabilitated ceiling details, the kind of quiet structural integrity that nobody notices because it's doing its job properly. Which is precisely the point. In the months afterward, things shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the way you might hope if you're expecting some transformed family unit with consistent dinner calls and resolved histories. It was slower than that. Smaller. My mother started texting occasionally. Not about anything in particular. Just the low-stakes things people send when they're trying to reopen a line that's been closed too long. My father called on my birthday in October for the first time in 11 years. He talked about the weather in Kingston and asked about a project I was working on, and I told him about it, and he listened in a way that felt like effort, which I accepted. Declan and I have had dinner in Ottawa 3 times since the wedding. He and Audrey moved to Kanata in the fall. We're not close in the way siblings who grew up close are close. We're building something different. Something that doesn't have the shorthand of shared memory, but has the honesty of 2 people who are choosing to show up for each other without pretending the past was something it wasn't. It's slower. It's more deliberate. I think in the long run it might be more solid for those reasons. Here is what I know now that I didn't know at 22. Standing in a warehouse in Kingston counting inventory at 2 in the morning. The story I told myself about my family for a long time was that I needed them to see me before I could be okay. That recognition from them was some kind of prerequisite, that the deficiency in how they treated me was a gap I was carrying, and only they could close it. That wasn't true. It took me years to understand that. The gap closed when I stopped waiting for them to close it, not when I succeeded, not when they finally noticed. Before that, long before that, in small private moments of choosing my work, my city, my people, my life. That was when I became someone I was comfortable being, and it had nothing to do with them finding out. The moment in the ballroom mattered, but not in the way people assume. It didn't validate me. I was already validated. What it did was open a door I had quietly stopped believing would ever open. And for the first time in 38 years, I decided to see what was on the other side. I'm still looking, carefully, without rushing. That turns out to be enough.